It's a great honor here that I would like to introduce our first keynote to kick off Source 2010. Andy Purdy, for those who don't know, has been active in the infosecurity space for a long time, to say the least. The first 20 years of his career, he was an attorney with both DOJ and then acting general counsel with the U.S. Sentencing Commission. In 2004, he was tapped to become the National Cybersecurity Czar at DHS, the acting director for NCSD. He, as far as I know, to my knowledge, has been the longest acting director. And I don't know if that's a merit or a detriment to your CV. Since then, he's been on numerous advisory boards and panels and commissions. He's co-director of the International Cyber Center at George Mason University. And recently, he was named, all of this is in his spare time, of course. Recently, he was named as the Chief Cybersecurity Strategist at CSC, where he's leading their IT assurance strategies and IT security architecture frameworks. It's a great honor to introduce Andy, who's a good friend and speaker here. Andy Purdy.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. How many of you participated in the Cyberstorm exercise a few years back? One of the first national cyber exercises was Cyberstorm in 2006. The participation was pretty good across the private sector and major folks in the government. DHS ran it, but we had all the key agencies in law enforcement, intel, civilian agencies, and we had a number of international folks participating as well. We gathered a group of folks from across the government after the first Cyberstorm exercises. We were talking about the lessons learned. And I think there's some things we can learn from some of these situations, and I hope at some point we will begin to learn some of these lessons. We had Department of Defense, NSA, CIA, FBI, all the major civilian agencies, and we met and we were talking about the kinds of cyber attacks that we were concerned about. And people were brainstorming, and in fact, it was a little disheartening as people were coming up with different kinds of scenarios. And we had just finished this Cyberstorm 1, and it was pretty clear we had some work to do. I vividly remember a representative of one of the agencies, and I probably shouldn't mention even which one, who kind of summed things up for the sense of people in the room, and he said, "We're doomed." And there was nervous laughter. And we said, well, okay, it kind of seems like we're doomed. And then, this was not a classified meeting, obviously, but it was not open. And so then we were talking about, okay, well, we're doomed, but what do we do about it? What do we do to try to position ourselves better? And after quite a lengthy conversation about the difficulties involved, the same gentleman said, it's hopeless. And the challenge of making progress when ownership and control is dispersed so much in our country and internationally is a problem that plagues us. We continue today. And you see it when we looked at things like the lessons learned from Cyberstorm 1. It was one of the most robust efforts of government and the private sector to try to analyze what had happened, what we attempted to do, what were the gaps, what processes were in place, what authorities may have been missing. And it was an absolutely fantastic roadmap for what our nation needed to do, not with the government in charge, but private sector and government working together. And I moved into the private sector after we had completed that after-action process. And I was part of the private sector group, the public-private partnership, under the exception to the Homeland Security Act for the Federal Advisory Committee Act. This structure was set up for public-private partnerships, and I encourage folks to join the organizations by your sector, and there's no charge for it, such as the IT Sector Coordinating Council. And so, as I was in that new role, again a volunteer, they were planning Cyberstorm 2. That was 2008. And I suggested to my colleagues, I didn't want to make it seem like I was being too critical of my former government colleagues, but I suggested to them that perhaps we needed to get the Department of Homeland Security or somebody to brief the private sector on what was done with the lessons learned from Cyberstorm 1, for which $3.5 million was spent. And I suggested that as we plan Cyberstorm 2, perhaps part of Cyberstorm 2 should be trying to test those things that had been improved so that we can then continue to make progress. Well, not we then, but DHS spent over $6 million for Cyberstorm 2. And I went to a senior official in DHS to ask about, and the private sector people didn't push forward either. So I mean, I think there are some issues on the appropriate role of the private sector and leadership. And I asked a senior official of DHS, well, what happened to those great after action? And one in particular I cited as an example, that at the Department of Homeland Security, there's a room probably about this size at the top secret SCI level with representatives of all the agencies and state and local government and even some major municipalities. It's called the National Operations Center. And it's very impressive, at least it was to me, with the screens that are showing basically the major activities, the major concerns around the country and things internationally that are affecting our country. And I participated in some of the daily briefings they would have each morning about things, oh, well, somebody came across the border and who was in the car with them and what were they tied to, and basically sharing information. And then, you know, the Postal Service or the FBI or the intelligence community would move forward with something. But the recommendation from Cyberstorm 1 was that we need to make sure that cyber was part of the National Operations Center, so that the visibility, not just when there's a crisis, but the visibility as to the steady state would be something that was available to all and that was part of the national landscape. I know it probably seems kind of obvious that cyber should be part of the national picture. But it's part of the governance problem that we have as a country, that this senior official, I said to this person, well, why haven't you, in the 2 years since Cyberstorm 1, included cyber in the National Operations Center at DHS? And the answer was, well, you know we're really busy. And just the day-to-day stuff that we have to do, and the stuff that's not really visible to the public, that we have all these bosses and you have to send them reports on things and information and update and the queries. I mean, it really is, it's not fun. And it's one of the tougher parts of being a public servant, frankly. And the person then said something that was very instructive about why we hadn't added cyber to the common operating picture for the nation. Nobody ever asked. Nobody ever followed up. The private sector didn't follow up. Congress didn't follow up. Nobody followed up. And so part of our challenge is to try to create visibility, not just that we have a big cyber problem and now, well, let's do something about it, which is kind of sort of where we are, but to try to have the government and private sector together identifying strategic national cyber priorities and goals and objectives. we moved forward from that day with the General Accountability Office did a report, and frankly, although we'd been the subject of some difficult GAO reports when I was in the private sector, I reached out to them to provide some input after Cyberstorm 2 about this problem, and I think they put out a pretty good report on it. But the problem for the folks in government, and Howard Schmidt is now the White House cyber coordinator, and I think he's attempting to do a really good job over there. But